Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for our webinar titled Winning with Cultural Brand Alignment and Localization, a Case Study on China. My name is James, and I'm your host for today. We've got a really informative session coming up today on a really exciting topic. But before we kick off with our discussion, just going to do a few housekeeping bits and bobs, and also introduce myself and my colleague guest speaker here today. So first of all, the webinar is being recorded, so you all get a copy of this in the weeks to come when it's live on our website. And please also feel free to share any insights throughout the webinar in the chat or via the Q&A. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so please do pop those in, and we look forward to answering your questions. So to quickly introduce myself, my name is James. I'm Head of Commercial at Comtech Translations. We're a UK-based B Corp language, localization and culture agency, supporting businesses of all different shapes and sizes and agencies with their international marketing and helping them expand overseas and do business successfully. I'm also delighted to be joined by a fantastic guest speaker today, someone I've had the pleasure of meeting several times and had lots of conversations with, Domenica Delietto. So please welcome Domenica, everyone. Domenica has 28 years of experience working in the marketing industry and is CEO and founder of Emerging Communications. Emerging Communications are a leading agency that provides strategic advice and digital marketing services for businesses and organizations looking to grow and expand into China. So some really exciting stuff that they're doing over at Emerging Comms. So what brings us both here today? So as with Domenica, I've got several years of experience working with international marketing teams who are looking to expand to new markets, whether it's APAC or EMEA. So there's a lot of similarities between both Emerging Comms and Comtech in the work that we do. Now, I'm sure our audience today, you're all familiar with the importance of translation, localization, transcreation when it comes to international marketing. But one key aspect that often gets overlooked is the culture aspect of things. For a brand to really land a new market, it's essential to understand the culture inside out. And no, we don't just mean food, drink, and fashion trends. It's much deeper than that. It goes all the way down to behaviors and how we operate as individuals. Cultural competence understanding is actually probably the most important aspect of understanding any international expansion, because it helps you inform your strategy, your content creation, your localization, and engagement with your audience. Every single culture is unique, yet perhaps one of the most unique and exciting cultures, at least from a UK perspective, one that's brimming of opportunity as well, is none other than China. So that's why I'm super excited today to be joined by Domenica, expert in all things China, and for her to share some really great advice on how, through cultural understanding, your marketing can perform really powerfully in China. So welcome, Domenica. Pleasure to have you on board today.
Really looking forward to this. I'm really passionate talking about culture. Having worked in this industry 12 years, and we're going to sort of discuss some interesting topics today. So welcome, everybody. Lovely to have you.
We've chatted a lot about culture ourselves, so get really excited to kind of share our chats with a wider audience. So Domenica, question number one for you. We've got several questions today I want to really pick your brains on. But let's kick things off. What is it about China that makes doing business there so different to the UK?
I think you have to almost see this like an onion, and you have to layer it. So the most important layer before we even get into culture is obviously you have significant restriction in China. You have restriction on channels, so none of the Western channels are available in China without using a VPN. They've got their own channels, which are ginormous, the likes of Weibo and Little Red Book and Douyin social channels and Baidu for search. This isn't a marketing session, but so compliance is different, which means that so you've got the kind of layering of the channels, but then you've got the compliance of what you are and aren't allowed to say government-wise. And certain categories are highly legislated, like pharma, medicine, property, investment, fintech, and finance. Some less so. But what we're allowed to say and what we're not allowed to say is not even a cultural thing, it's a compliance thing.
Wow.
Then you layer it down, and because China is ginormous and geographically diverse, many different seasons, weathers, dialogues, languages, cultures, and then you break it down further into clusters, and you realize that you've got to almost be aware of what are you allowed to do
Yeah.
talking to, and how will it resonate with them. We call it localization because you've still got to maintain the global brand. So for those people on this call that are big brands, you don't want your brand to look different in China to say the rest of the world.
Yeah.
But you've got to localize the messaging and localize the creative and localize the channel and localize the approach. So I don't call it localization, I call it globalization, because you've kind of got to balance the two. So it is very, very different, and very complex. Yeah.
Yeah, I really get the sense of the onion peeling away the layers when you're mentioning all of
Yeah,
those different
absolutely. Yeah.
things. I think that is so true with culture. I mean, my experience is much more on European culture, but it's very similar, I guess, in terms of the concept. But yeah, China, this enormous beast of a country, it's huge. So
Yeah.
yeah, it must manifest on a totally different level.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you touched on it very briefly what you said just then, but I'd also like to look at how culture manifests differently across different regions in China. Obviously, in the UK, there's lots of different colloquialisms and dialects, I guess, from different
Yeah.
parts of the UK. What does that look like in China? Because we're obviously a very tiny country compared to China.
Yeah, you find geographical differences in audiences significantly in China. For example, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, is a very different culture to Beijing or in the
Yeah,
northern territories of China. But it also, you find culture massively different by age groups as well.
yeah,
So the Chinese Gen Z behave very differently to Gen X and behave very differently to millennials.
yeah,
The way that they consume messaging, media, marketing, their behavior is very different. So it's an age thing, it's a geography thing, and then you have to cluster further into behavior. So we certainly don't use any kind of demographic segmentation anymore. We're very much, well, who are the audience in terms of a cluster? And do they cluster around a geography in China? So, for example, if we're doing a targeted campaign, it might be that it's only a tier one city campaign. It's rare, but it might be. Maybe it's for a particular university course, or it might be that certain regions are more likely to buy the product or service. But really, you're drilling into clusters of individuals. And yes, so you do get geographical variance. You get different language,
yeah.
different behavior and culture, but it really is done at a much more micro level than that. Otherwise, you just literally would spend a fortune trying to target mass homogenous groups, which is not how China works. Yeah.
No. That makes, I mean, that's really, really clear. I think again, I think the targeting is so important.
Critical, yeah.
One thing you touched on, I think is really important that we should unpick a little bit more is again the different age groups. Obviously, the kind of today's workforce is made up of kind of Gen Z, millennials, and Gen X, and we're seeing in the UK quite significant differences when we look at how each age group generation is. I suppose millennials, I'm a millennial, we're kind of in the middle of the Gen Z and the Gen X, bit of both, I suppose, in terms of how different. But how, if we're looking at Gen Z in China versus Gen X in China, how have things changed in terms of kind of how they operate in their behaviors?
Well, if you consider, I mean, you have it here, but to a much larger extent in China,
Yeah,
Gen Z have grown up with the internet. They've grown up with everything on their phone, and in
yeah,
China, it's much more prevalent. So everything's
wow,
mobile first. Everything is done by mobile, so they are very used to, as I am when I'm in China, you don't carry a wallet, you don't carry keys, you carry a phone and a charger. That's all you need. And that is used for everything. I mean, down to the fact that if you're giving money to somebody who is begging on the street or a street vendor for a bottle of water, you will use WeChat Pay or Alipay from your phone. But this has been going
wow,
for 12 years. Whereas here we've only just discovered your QR codes and digital. Same with AI technology. So
yeah,
and um, and virtual reality. We've had 3D technology in China for a long time now, over 6, 7, 8 years. It's only just made its way to Europe. You know, when you see
yeah,
advertising and it's completely immersive and it's, you know, you've got a dinosaur coming out of the screen. This has been going on for a very long time. The way that things are consumed. So the e-commerce market in China is extremely mature.
mm,
It's all influencers are really big part of decision making. So, but basically, I mean, it really matters. Or really matters. It's much easier to explain the behavior of, say, Gen Z versus their parents or their parents' parents
yeah.
more by category. So
Yeah.
Chinese students coming here behave very differently to the way their parents would have searched for a university, say in Europe or the UK,
Yeah.
or the way that they purchase property or the way that they purchase FMCGs. It's all changed. But fundamentally, the digital evolution that we've
Yeah.
seen here in Europe happened 6, 8, 10 years ahead in China. So they
Mm.
don't know any other world.
Yeah.
They're very savvy. They're very fussy.
Yeah.
They're very much what's in it for me. And China is set up for one-to-one comms. So the way that we
Yeah.
were in the 90s with email, China does that all through very, very clever digitech.
Mm.
So there's a lot more automation, a lot more use of AI and etc. They're just very digitally savvy and
Yeah.
also really big on sustainability. So that's really important. So
Fantastic.
it is just brands making an assumption that they're big elsewhere and then they go to China. That's flawed strategy. And you've got to understand your audiences. And that will help when we get onto culture in a minute. You
Yeah.
understand those audiences, then you will understand the culture of those audiences, those clusters. And then you superimpose any compliance on top of that. But all of the audiences we target for different categories are very, very different.
Yeah. Coming back to the onion example, there's so many layers again here
There are, yeah.
to talk about this. And I think it's fascinating to see the difference of in Gen Z versus here, I suppose, in China. And it sounds hearing that, the tech revolution, the AI evolution has happened much sooner over in China. It's much more habitual than it is here, perhaps. People are still
Absolutely, yeah.
adopting some of the things. Like for a marketer, that must be like they've got to completely the rules are all rewritten, aren't they? They've got to completely adapt their process because they've got to think ahead, much further ahead for China than we would here. So, yeah, that sounds like a lot to think about. So, yeah, again, really important to kind of know the culture and help you, that will help you inform the strategy and how you do your marketing there. So, really, really useful example. I think let's come and look at culture actually as a next point. I think one thing we see often when we look at the internet, and especially from a translation perspective, is these so-called translation fails, we call them. So brands trying to translate, and it's always an advertising. It's always an advertising campaign. You see these big billboards or branding, and brands have tried to translate advertisements or slogans, either literally or using AI, and it's not the best way. When you're doing any kind of advertising, transcreation, minimal approach, copywriting, you've really got to understand the audience and tailor it for the audience. But obviously, China, again, we've talked about already, massive differences compared to here in the UK. Thinking of how a Chinese consumer is different to a UK consumer, can you give us some examples of what could go wrong if brands don't take the time to really understand the audience and strategize from a cultural perspective?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Let's first start with language and culture. So
Yeah,
I probably would have maybe 5 calls a week with people who assume you can translate English to Chinese. You cannot. The Chinese sentence structure is very different. And also you can have numerous characters for the pinyin, which
yeah,
basically means if you get the character wrong or you put 2 characters together, it will change the meaning of the sentence. So
yeah,
I'm going to give an example. Nike did a campaign not that long ago. Nike is very established in China, very
yeah,
popular in China as more of a fashion brand. And they had 2 characters on each shoe, which should be fine because they were both prosperity characters, so both about money.
yeah.
It's good luck in China. But you put them together and the meaning was of being fat. So this is the thing about Chinese characters is if you put 2 characters together in the wrong order, you can signify fat, death, being poor, all these things that are deemed as
Yeah,
unlucky. Then you've got obviously the obvious ones are you don't ever use the number 4, which sounds like death, and there are many things like that. But if you layer the onion, there
yeah,
are definite no-nos. So firstly, don't assume you can directly translate into Chinese. You cannot.
yeah,
Be aware of absolute no-nos in terms of things you just would never do.
yeah,
And if you're working with a Chinese expert, Chinese copywriter and a Chinese cultural expert, they'll know all of this. Then you've got to go, well, what are the cultural cues for this audience? So firstly, compliance-wise, what would the government not allow and what would
Yeah.
be deemed as inappropriate anyway? So for example, you never ever separate Taiwan, Hong Kong and China, ever. That is a
Yeah.
no-go. They are one country to all intents and purposes for China. There are certain things you would never say and do, but there are many campaigns I can use as examples where you've had a global brand assume a certain premise of
Yeah.
Chinese audiences without drilling down to understanding them. There was a recent Burberry campaign for Chinese New Year. Burberry have been established in China for many years, and in fact, the brand is very popular.
Yeah.
Of course. And they did a Chinese New Year campaign of a family all together and all wearing Burberry. Now, nothing wrong with that. Chinese New Year is all about family. It's all about gifting. It's all about being together. But everybody looked miserable. And so, of course, there was this massive backlash on social media that it looked like a funeral, and it did. The
Yeah.
campaign looked like a funeral. It looked like it was grandma's funeral, but she was still alive. So that was disastrous. Everybody's heard of the D&G campaign. I still use D&G campaign because it's still one of the worst examples I've ever
Yeah.
seen of being too global. So it was planned in the head office in Italy, and it had a beautiful young lady who was eating spaghetti and eating pizza with chopsticks. Now that's rude.
Yeah.
That's an assumption that your Chinese audiences don't understand how to use a knife and fork.
Yeah.
That's an assumption that the audiences that you're trying to target in China aren't highly westernized, aren't highly educated. And when I go to China, I could one day be eating Italian just as much as I could be eating local Chinese or a hot pot, because it's such an eclectic mix of food opportunities. It was so disastrous. They've not really recovered from that. There are so many instances of either incorrect strap lines,
Yeah.
incorrect use of characters. So that's very much a language thing, understanding the language, or just cultural inappropriateness is probably not a very good word, but you know what I mean. I mean, even Pepsi. And this again is about understanding language. It was supposed to say "Come alive with Pepsi" generation. What
Yeah.
it actually said was "Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the dead."
Yeah.
And this was launched a long, long time ago. But the point is, it's about the use of Chinese characters. And I mean, I've been studying Chinese for 4 years, and I can tell you that the sentence structure is different. Characters come in blocks of 1, 2, or 3 characters generally. So if you put characters in the wrong place or you pair them, it will change the meaning completely. And it's a very emotive language, which is about understanding the meaning of what you're trying to say. So if we do any copywriting, of which is, I would say, 80% of what we do is copywriting in one form or another, we use copywriters. You don't use AI technology or a translator, because it has to be written to actually evoke the meaning and inspire the audience, especially with marketing, and it has to be done in Chinese. We'll back translate for the UK audience, the English, marketing decision makers, so they understand what we've said, but you've got to create everything in Chinese. So it's partly a language thing, it's partly a behavioral thing, and it's partly a compliance thing. There's 3 layers to culture really in China.
Yeah.
And you're talking about a very nationalistic society. It doesn't matter how much your audience travel, and whether or not they're studying here or where they're residing, they're very nationalistic. So anything that upsets the status quo about being Chinese or is deemed to be rude or patronizing
Yeah.
will be a PR disaster. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's quite scary that you've named like 3, 4 actually big brands there that have got it wrong. We all know those brands. We all consume those brands. Like we've all bought Nike trainers, we've all drunk a Pepsi. But it's just really interesting to see that even the big guys get it wrong. And I think you're so right when it comes to that kind of real cultural awareness in like, targeted advertising marketing, you've got to think with the cultural hat on and
Yeah.
understanding behaviors. I mean, and it's beyond the text, it's the visuals, it's the behaviors. I mean, we do a lot of work with kind of when we're doing slogans, it's really taking the meaning and you're translating the meaning, not the words. And then there's all the visuals around that. So we do a lot of work with kind of advising on different colors to use in different markets that might have different connotations, or checking the layout. As I said, you've got the Nike example is really, really prevalent. I think checking things in situ even, as well as doing the copywriting is also so important to see how it looks visually, because again, I've seen that in the past kind of cause issues. So yeah, some really, really scary examples there. But let's flip this on its head. So we've talked about what it looks like when it goes wrong. What can look like when it goes right? I know you've shared some great examples with me in the past when we've spoken to Dominica about brands that have really, really understood their audience and really succeeded as a result. It'd be great if you could share a couple of those with us today.
Absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of really established Western brands in China, and there are also a lot of relatively new brands
Yeah,
that are Western or British in China that have got it right. So if you create marketing messaging using a very experienced copywriter, what you can do is evoke emotion. That's the first thing. We did one recently with the Unite students. We've done another one with a couple of our property clients where we spend so much time on the strapline and so much time on the
yeah,
lead-in copy for advertising and promotions to almost you evoke an emotion
yeah,
and evoke a sense of immediacy, but it's spot on. And one of the great thing about Chinese characters is the sound of a Chinese character can be used in a name. So you can have either direct translation iteration as much as one can do, or you can actually work with the sounds of the Chinese characters, and that works really well. McDonald's are really, really good at
yeah.
product adaptation,
Uh,
and so are KFC in China. So if you go into McDonald's anywhere in the world, you'll find that they localize their food offering, and they do that exactly that
yeah,
in China. But their marketing is some of the most emotive, effective I've ever seen in the world. They
yeah.
do a really, really good job. And they recently did a fantastic campaign for their cheeseburgers in China, where because the pronunciation of cheese is similar to pronunciation to an emergency. So the whole idea was you have to go and get a cheeseburger immediately. But the thing that you can be in China, depending on the brand, obviously if you're a farmer or you're in, I don't know, finances, maybe not. But with a lot of the brands like McDonald's and KFC,
Yeah,
use humor. And
yeah,
humor works really well in China, especially on Douyin and Little Red Book. Humor, and there's a lot of really effective campaigns where they take the actual audience, they take the actual consumers, the actual customers, and they're part of the story, they're part of the advert, they're part of the campaign. I mean, I've even seen some really immersive, fantastic advertising recently where they are literally have it's almost like a stage at
wow,
bus stops where you've got actors or consumers being part of the set. Very clever. So I think brands that localize. So it's very
yeah,
clearly McDonald's, it's very clearly KFC,
yeah.
um, but they have managed, and Lego as well in China is really, really doing an amazing job.
Wow,
Very clearly those brands, but totally localized to the way that you live, breathe, and live your life in China. There's been a couple of coffee brands. Starbucks has done a good job, although
yeah.
its market share is being eroded with some local players, as a
Oh,
lot of
wow.
the bigger brands are. But they really understand this 886 culture in China, which is a lot of especially young adults working in China work 8 till 8, 6 days a week. They're
Wow.
really tired. It's not a culture of necessarily looking after their people like it is here. And so a lot of the brands like coffee brands, sleep bed brands have jumped on that and just gone, well, look, you're really tired. So you need to go to sleep. You need our mattress to get more sleep, or you need
Yeah,
our mattress to keep you awake. And so you see, again, a lot of humor, a lot of understanding what people
yeah,
are going through. Some people have jumped on the sustainability element, especially there's a real massive influx of food and drink brands and veganism and health and yoga, etc. And that's what a lot of the big sort of like fitness brands have jumped onto. So
yeah,
it's really understanding behavior and culture and threading that into your narrative, but doing it in a way that's authentic. And coming back to copywriting just a minute, there is this assumption, and I've spoken to some of the biggest brands in the world, and they still do it, and they literally will have somebody in the office, and this is the big A5A agencies do it as well. Somebody in the office who happens to be Chinese national, but they're not a copywriter.
yeah,
That's not enough. Now, a Chinese national can read some copy and go, that makes sense or it doesn't, but you need a copywriter to create a story. because it's very competitive. So yeah, so I mean, there are lots of examples of getting it right or wrong. I think the category that's particularly affected, and I see the most disasters, is the luxury category, because it's
Really? Yeah.
so hard to get it right in China. I mean, there was a recent campaign M&S did here, there was a backlash. There was a recent campaign Zara, there was a backlash, with other markets in UAE, with everything going on,
Yeah.
Palestine, etc. But thankfully, some of those campaigns didn't make their way to China, but I have seen some that have, and of course they are
Yeah.
pulled down. Well, the government won't accept them on a lot of channels anyway, but they're pulled down very, very quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting that the examples you shared. I mean, McDonald's, I mean, that's one I've got experience with from a kind of localization, but also, as a consumer, like when you go into McDonald's in different countries, you see the whole food offering is completely localized. Like that whole product is different because it's for the audience. I think little things like that, understanding what the audience want, is so, so important. Another one I'm always been really impressed with is Haribo. Obviously, we've
Yes.
got the kids and grown-ups love it, say the happy word of Haribo. From a European perspective, they've kept the rhyme. The words are different. The meaning is pretty much the same. But like if you look at France, Spain, Germany, Italy, it still rhymes. They've taken that because it's the memorable rhyme, and that's what the kids and the parents really engage with. So I think it's fascinating, like adapting it for the culture while still keeping the meaning at a global level, what the brand is. So yeah, really, really fascinating stuff. And yeah, I love those examples. I think McDonald's do really, really well, from my own experiences of traveling, just in general around Europe. So yeah, really, really good. So to finish off, Domenica, if you could give brands looking to expand into China, sorry, three top tips for success, what would they be?
Number one, know your audience. So know the clusters you're trying to target, because once you know that, then everything else I'm about to tell you will work. So what resonates, what doesn't, how do they behave, what would they buy into, who are they? Because you can't treat China as one homogenous mass. Number two, what is the compliance around your industry? So what are you allowed to say, not allowed to say? What channels can you use? And there are, as I said earlier, a number of categories that are more compliant driven. Medicine being number one, number two being financial, number three being property. So there are words you can use, there are words you can't, there are things you can do, there are things you can't. And then lastly, globalize. So you need to be recognizable as your global or national brand, but you need to localize the messaging, the creative, the channel, and the approach for your audiences in China. I've got a whingy dog, sorry. So basically, it's really, really important that you do those three things in that order. There's no point doing anything before you know your audience.
Yeah.
And I talk to so many big global brands who are failing in China, and that is the number one reason why.
Yeah.
And let's face it, most brands don't have PR disasters in China. They just don't really do very well. And if you don't do very well, it's because what you're saying is not what the audience want to hear. It doesn't resonate. So that understanding the customer clusters, and not just saying Gen Z, that's absolutely ginormous market.
Yeah.
Really understanding a micro cluster, you would call it in China, because it's so big. Once you understand that, everything can go from there. And if Burberry had done that, they'd have gone, well, Chinese New Year is about happiness. Our target market is, generally speaking, between 20 and 50. So is a photographic shoot going to work where everybody looks like they're at a funeral? Well, of course not. So basically, it's really, really important to think about those three things.
Fantastic.
I think the fact that a lot of decision making still happens at head office. That's why we're here. That's why we operate and work with clients here in Europe, because of time zones and language and culture, etc. That's great. You still need to have the global brand needs to be recognizable. You've got to be aware of the brand essence and brand guidelines, but it does need to be localized for China. And that goes down to typography.
Yeah.
That goes down to the name of the company, really important. Your messaging. So it has to be localized, but it has to be also visible that it is that brand. That is what McDonald's and Lego do well, and Haribo. It's very, very, very recognizable.
Yeah.
it takes commitment to the Chinese market.
Yeah, I think those three tips are spot on, and I think just the point one is understand the audience is so important. And that's exactly why we're here today, to kind of really look at China as an example and say this is how you understand your audience and what you can achieve if you do.
Yeah.
No, that was so fascinating. Love listening to all of that, Dominica. So many inspiring points and just interesting points around China, which is, yeah, for a lot of us, oh, it's a huge market. How do we tackle it? So, but yeah, one bring opportunities. So hopefully we're giving everyone some food for thought. So we have some time for questions. We don't have any in the chat currently, but if anyone would like to pop a question in the Q&A or in the webinar chat function, please do, and we'll look into those. Also, if you've got any experiences you've had working or going into China, whether success or lack thereof potentially, or any mistakes you've made, we'd love to hear from you. So please do pop those in the chat. I'll see if any come through.
Cool. Yeah, it's a fascinating country.
Absolutely. I think, again, the onion, there's so much to unpick there. Just the sheer size alone, it's a huge geography with lots of different diverse people, and yeah, it's different from the UK. So oh, we have some comments. So really good. So Kate Porter, thank you so much, Kate. She says no question, but she's enlightened, excited, and terrified in equal measure. So that's very lovely to hear. Thank you, Kate.
I wouldn't be terrified. You just need to work with somebody that knows what they're doing. The examples I've used, you would think that big brands would do that, but there is, I would say, the word to avoid in culture is assumption. Don't assume anything. Talk to somebody that knows the audience, because things change all the time. What you might have got away with now, or 5 years ago, you can't get away with now. I mean, the legislation is tightening by the day, so don't be frightened. Just work with an expert to look after you. That's the most important thing, I would say.
So true. So true. We've had a couple of questions come in as well. We had three, which is exciting. So we'll go through each of those. So firstly, we have one from Joanna. She says, it will be great to hear what will be your step 1, 2, and 3 for planning a Chinese market entry.
Oh my God, probably need a bit longer than 2 minutes. I would say number one, if anybody's done any kind of analysis, look at the macro environment. Okay, so are you going to be able to compete? So what competition have you got? And if you're already in China, just making sure you know your customers that you're trying to target and that you've got something that your customers want. Pretty obvious stuff. People don't do this. I remember talking to a crisp brand who will remain nameless 8 years ago and trying to explain to them that crisps weren't even a snack of choice in China at that time. It's changed. But so you need to be sure you've got a market. So I'm assuming you have, and you've done that. Then the next thing is to look at your environment. So have a look at your customers that you want to target and what you're going to offer. Because if you're an e-commerce brand with 5,000 SKUs, you might choose that you're going to do cross-border with 500 SKUs, and there's a number of ways of doing that. Or if you are a B2B player and you're driving leads, you might want to put a salesperson in market and get a marketing agency like us to put together a plan to support that sales agent with leads. So you need to be thinking about basically how you're going to get your goods or services to the customers. Or it could be that you start with, as we've done with a lot of brands, Chinese based here, test the market, and then you expand accordingly. So your route to market, your channel to market, then it's a question, you know who your customers are, how you're going to get the products and services to them, and we would put together a plan. Social media will be part of that, irrespective of whether it's complex B2B or it's B2C brand, because social media is so prevalent in the decision making of Chinese. But there are so many channels. So once you know the audience, we can choose the channel, and then we can create a comms plan with hierarchy, so the brand level down to what the messaging is that we're trying to achieve. And what was I saying? So the dog's whining, so it's a bit distracting. So essentially, the comms plan comes first, then a channel plan, and then we would activate that. So there is actually on our website, and I'm happy to share with this audience, I have a 8-step plan for China entry. And you just need to literally make sure you've ticked those things off. And so that's probably, so not really 3, it's 8 steps. But the number 1 is, do you have a market? And the number 2 is, you know, who are your customers. And once you know who your customers are and that they want what you've got, and knowing local and global competition is really important, then it's a question of comms and channel planning. Just avoid anybody you speak to that says, oh, you need Baidu, oh, you need Douyin. You don't know what you need till you know who you're targeting. And just throw a lot of money at it, a lot of mud at a wall and hope it will stick. It's got to be the right channel, right message, right time, right cluster. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Lisa just popped up in the chat as well. She loved the 8-step plan for entry. I believe it's available on your website, isn't it, Domenica?
It is, but I'm happy. I mean, connect with me on LinkedIn, Domenica Diglietto, and I can send it to you. Or maybe I send it to you, James, and we send it to the audience. Happy to do that.
Yeah,
Just
absolutely.
an infographic, very basic. But the amount of times I get asked, where do I start? And actually, the client, when they look at the 8-step plan, will go, actually, I've done 4 of those already. So it's not as scary as I thought. But it's about balancing the mitigation of risk with the return. And I'm a real believer in, it's a bit like a staircase when you go into China. You're not going to go from nothing to all in. So it's a bit of a staircase. So it's about mitigating risk with return, mitigating risk with return. So there is a step-by-step process to do that.
Brilliant. Awesome. We've got 4 more questions, so we might have to fire through these for everyone's time. But question number 1 is, why do you think bigger brands get it wrong so many times?
Assumptions. That's it. There's assumptions and a little bit of ego. I mean, not a huge brand, but Pret, Marks and Spencer's, Tesco's have all retreated from China. They've made an assumption that they can do the same thing in China that they've done in other European markets. So Pret, for example, when they launched, and I went in there, they didn't change the product offering at all. And of course, what Pret offers is not what Chinese consumers would eat for breakfast or lunch. It was all cold food. And it was very Europeanized. So, I mean, that's one tiny example. And Marks and Spencer's put their underwear next to the tills. You would never do that culturally in China. You never mix clothing, especially not underwear, with food. So there are, I think I would say, assumptions and just general ego. We don't need to look at this market separately, differently. Everybody's the same. And also assumptions that they understand the market and they've not been there. If you went to China in the 1990s, early 2000s, it's not the same place. And so I get a lot of people saying stuff to me and I go, that isn't China in 2024. Yeah. That's China in 1996.
Yeah.
And so I'd say assumptions is why they get it wrong. Yeah.
Makes complete sense. Couple from James. So he says, how might one approach branding in cities such as Shenzhen, where it's located in a particular distinct area of China, but it's become a Mandarin mishmash of people from everywhere? How local does local need to be?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, because Shenzhen is a really interesting city. Metropolis, I would call it. It's ginormous. It's very digitech, so robotic hotels and cocktail bars and robotic cars. And it's when on my MBA, when we were doing digitech and I was talking to the lecturer, I said, that's where you need to take the electives, not to Tel Aviv or to Silicon Valley. They need to go to Shenzhen. So in answer to your question, I would say get in touch with me later, because I don't know what your product or service is or what category you're operating in. If you can put it on there, I'll have a bit more guidance. Depends on what you're trying to do. But I'd need to know what you're trying to do. Shenzhen is a very, very Europeanized, westernized, globalized audience, like Hong Kong, like Shanghai. But it's rare that you can do anything where you can completely segment down to a city. You can do programmatic that will do that, and Baidu paid search, but it's unlikely that you're not going to transcend. So you've still got to think about Chinese culture per se. You've really got to think about your audience culture. The fact that you're in Shenzhen is neither here nor there, but I don't know if you're a standalone store. And if that's the case, it would be a very different approach to if you're B2B. So I'd need to know what you do. But Shenzhen's a very interesting city. I haven't been for a few years and I want to go back when I'm next in China. Yeah.
Sounds very futuristic, all the robots.
It looks like something out of a sci-fi film. Amazing. Honestly, it's amazing place.
Awesome. Right, next question. It's a different angle. What mistakes do Chinese brands make when they go into the UK or the West? Do they also make the same kind of mistakes?
Yes, they do.
Yeah,
And I talk to a lot of Chinese brands. We aren't specialist in that because all of my staff are Chinese nationals and we're operating on Chinese channels in Chinese. But I think the biggest thing is the culture of doing business with the Brits or with the Europeans for a Chinese brand is really different. We're
yeah,
very different. The marketing, messaging, and approach for Europe is very different. So you can get away with humor to a real large extent in China, and also the use of emotion that you would just never get away with here. We just go, oh my God, what is that?
yeah,
So I think they really struggle to understand our culture of business and of marketing, messaging, and creative. And it's really quite strange, isolating and lonely for a lot of Chinese GMs that come over here and they're tasked with Europe and they're like, oh heck, help. So it goes just as much the other way. But I think the difference is from the Chinese brands I've spoken to and worked with is that there isn't that assumption that they know what they're doing.
got you.
And I think that's why so many like Shein and Temu, who actually only operate outside of China, believe it or not, are so successful over here is because they didn't make assumptions and they got Western teams to do it.
Excellent. There's such an ego thing there, isn't there, with the assumptions? It's so yeah, I can just I can see it.
It's a size thing as well.
Yeah,
The people say to me, oh, do I need to have millions to be successful in China? No, you need a plan. Because actually, some of the biggest brands in the world have failed in China because they're so big. Their decision making is so hierarchical. It's all at head office that they can't accept that they need a localized or globalized approach, and that they need specialist agency. And then what they do, and I'd say the biggest mistake actually, and I'm not being against the big 5A agencies, but that is what they do. They go, well, we're already with that agency, so let's just go to that agency in Shanghai. Now, if you are not spending 10 million a year in China at a big 5 agency, you will not get anybody who knows what they're doing within the China office. You'll get the intern. And I've seen it happen time and time again. And that's most of the clients that we end up working with. They realize they need a specialist agency where they're looked after, and where they're not a small fish in a big pond.
yeah.
And if you're spending millions and millions and millions, you'll be looked after in China, but not if you're not spending very much. Yeah.
Fascinating. Cool. Thank you for that one. And one last question from Susie. So her experience in China is that consumers are hungry for content of any kind, even if it's low value. She'd like to know if this has been your experience too, and how could they elevate their content to counteract this need?
Can you say that again? Because I didn't get about content? What did you say? Sorry.
Yeah, so their experience in China has been that consumers are hungry for any type of content, including low value content. Um, is this, Domenic, is this your experience too? And how could we elevate their content to counteract this need?
Do you mean hungry for content? Is that the word you said?
Hungry,
All
yes.
right. Okay. So, yes, but it's got to be the right content. So, video is really important now in China. So I think one of the biggest shifts I've seen in the last 2 years is that Gen Z audiences now will search on Little Red Book or Douyin. So Douyin is a video platform. Little Red Book's like a very advanced Insta. They don't use search engines at all. Now,
Yeah,
that's really important to understand. So they are consuming content on social to make decisions about any kind of brand decision, education, property, toothpaste, hair care,
yeah,
fashion, you name it. So video content and content that actually resonates is what's important. I'm not a believer in volume. I'm a believer in quality. So
yeah,
I would say put your effort behind quality content, and that is content that's going to resonate. And if you know what the audience is, how they behave, their culture, this comes back to understanding your audiences, then you will create content that works. So be really, really mindful, or wary, should I say, of people that think that it's all about reach. That is doesn't matter. It's
yeah,
actually about shares, comments, engagement, and make sure the comments, you can put it through a machine or ask somebody like us to look at it. Make sure the comments aren't created by said agency, and they're not actually authentic. And you can tell that by the tone of the Chinese characters. It's really easy to see if it's just robot content or it's actual real content. But for us, all we're interested in is engagements, shares, comments, and ideally, in most instances, where we can do the whole top to bottom of the funnel, we're looking at leads or we're looking at sales.
Yeah.
So that's what matters. So they are hungry for content, but it's got to be the right content, or it's just noise, because it is so noisy in China that you are bombarded with interactive content on the tube, in the taxi, when you're walking around the city, and it's everywhere, absolutely everywhere, and it's all digitally, delivered. So it's quality over quantity, because actually it doesn't really matter if what you're delivering isn't resonating. You could do 1,000 posts a day and it wouldn't make any difference.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Domenica. I think your insights today have been absolutely brilliant. I think it's been really fascinating to see. We're big believers in cultural competence understanding here at Comtech, and things are, localization, really making sure you're resonating with the audience and achieving your objectives. And while we've done a lot of kind of promotion around cultural awareness in our communications and marketing and event, it's been really nice to focus in on specifically one culture and really see how these things get brought to life. And I think it's been really fascinating to understand China, which it can feel scary to UK brands because they're so different from us. But I think we've got so much food for thought here today, and also a lot of these principles extend to any market we're looking at, really. So I think there's so much food for thought here. So really thank you for your time today, Domenica, and thank you everyone for your attendance and all your excellent questions. They've been really, really helpful. If you'd like to get in touch with both of us, please connect with us both on LinkedIn, so Domenica Lieto and James Brown. Also, please follow Comtech and Emerging Comms on LinkedIn as well. We can help you in terms of any localization, transcreation, cultural awareness and understanding services. And Domenica can help you with all things marketing, international strategy, and content creation specifically for China. So please do get in touch with us if you're interested and need any support in either of those areas. As I mentioned at the start, we'll be sending around the recording in the next few weeks, and along with some resources as well. But also, please check out our websites where you can download lots of useful guides. So thank you all so much for today. It's been a pleasure, and we have a fantastic day ahead, everyone. Thank you very much.
So much, James.
Take care. Thank you, Domenica. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.